Hey everyone, welcome. I have with me today for some interesting conversation, Roger Thisdell. Um, Roger's someone whose work I encountered actually in there's a Qualia Computing Network Facebook group that I'm a part of. I guess we're both a part of, and I discovered. I'm not sure if you posted it or someone else posted it, but it was a video showing jhana meditation in real time with some explanatory phenomenological descriptions. And as someone who I'm interested in jhana meditation and thought, wow, this is really cool. I'd love to talk about this and also talk about exactly what that means, because it might, what that word means can vary a little bit in different practices and traditions. So, but anyway, when I looked in a little bit more, you've got a YouTube channel, meditative.dev, and you're about to start a master's degree at the University of Edinburgh in epistemology, ethics, and mind with cognitive science.
Yes.
You are also now a member of the EPRC, the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium. And I guess there's clearly a lot of theoretical background that you can bring to the meditative phenomenology as well, which is what I'm really interested in. But one of the main reasons why what you were doing stood out to me a little bit is because a lot of the stuff I'm doing is focused on metamodern spirituality and integral theory and things like that, where the development of state capacities and skillful development of state skills is a topic that relates also to the change of like long-term traits, which is this area that I'm becoming more interested in, is how state training can become kind of permanent or long-lasting realities physiologically and mentally. And so one of the things that just came out briefly in one of the videos that you did, but I thought was really interesting, was you talk about having now kind of well, I'll let you describe it. I'll read this little bio, and maybe that'll kind of set it up, and then we can talk about it a little bit. But here's your bio over at the EPRC. From a young age, Roger had a very low hedonic set point, but over the years, through introspective and meditative practices, he has managed to tremendously increase his baseline well-being to a level much above the norm. He now has a mind which represents itself as permanently centreless and without the sense of a singly positioned epistemic agent. He aims to help others achieve similar levels of baseline well-being and mental unperturbability by providing guidance with his online meditation group at meditative.dev. And then there's a little bit more there. But yeah, you were talking about from your experience doing jhana meditation, reaching a point in that practice where basically certain of those states had essentially become permanent traits. And so I wanted to maybe explore some of that. So anyway, that's by way of a really long introduction.
Cool. Well, thank you for introducing me, and thank you for inviting me here. I'm
really thank you.
Looking forward to this.
so let's dive in a little bit. So contextually, speak a little bit about the kind of jhana meditation that you're talking about. I have a conception of it, but I want to know if we're kind of thinking of the same things, or what kind of tradition that is. And I guess maybe one way you could do that is go through the different jhanas and what that looks like, and maybe talk about some of that lineage.
Sure. So how to describe the jhanas? I mean, traditionally there's 8 jhanas, and they're a series of like 8 deeply concentrated, absorbed, altered states you can get into. Each one has a different meditation object that you focus on, or nimitta that you focus on, that you build and build to the point where that ultimately should encompass the totality of your experience, or a big bulk of your experience. The first one is piti, or sort of very pleasant body sensations. The second jhana is focusing on sukha, which is sort of emotional joy, happiness. Third one is contentment. Fourth one, equanimity. fifth one, and then after 4, you kind of move to a space that sort of the feeling of the physical body really drops off, and the fifth one is boundless space. Sometimes they say infinite space, but I actually think boundless space is a better framing of it. And sixth one, boundless consciousness. Then seventh one, nothingness. Eighth one, neither perception nor non-perception. And then, like in the video, this sort of sometimes what's called the ninth jhana is like cessation, where consciousness turns off for a blip. So, my inspiration for doing the jhanas is, like Lee Brasington's work, his book, Right Concentration, following sort of Rob Babea has some great sort of lecture series on the jhanas where he just sort of describes what they're like. And there's a lot of debate, I guess, about, the definitions of the jhanas, what constitutes a jhana, the criteria for getting into them.
Right. So I got into this material through Lee Brasington's work, that book you mentioned, Right Concentration, which for me was a real game changer. It's called A Practical Guide to the Jhanas, and he does just a great job of presenting the material rooted in he's going back to the sutta material in which these states are described in various ways, and sort of basing his practice on those descriptions there. But not just theoretically, but like really giving, really great concrete teaching skills for be able to cultivate these states. And when I discovered that, it was really good. So I began, exploring that method, and it seemed to hold up, so to speak. So I had that kind of, experimental and experiential reality to it, which was like, this is really cool. But one of the things that Brasington talks about in the book is that the jhanas have been, there are these jhana debates about, well, what are these things that people have been referring to as the jhanas? And he does, I think, a pretty good job. And I'm most of my familiarity comes from him. So maybe there's more that you could fill in about this, or other resources you could direct me to. But the picture that I get from him is that, that originally these states are kind of described in the suttas, but then they become almost unattainably kind of represented once you start moving into the more like scholastic era of Buddhism and the Abhidhamma and the path of purification and things like that, where trying to cultivate the jhanas as described there would seem almost impossible. And so basically the notion is that, well, at some point, what the understanding was of the jhanas has shifted, and maybe these meditative states are completely real and exist and whatnot, but maybe they weren't originally what was being described in the sutta material. And so anyway, yes, these debates about what these states are is still a live debate, I guess. And so that's why when I hear people saying that they practice jhana meditation, I'm sort of like, well, what does that mean? And yeah, so it sounds like we're very much talking about the same thing, in the same sort of states, which is cool. So yeah, so then I posted this video where you and your kind of colleague or friend at your channel, you're both doing a meditative practice. Sean, yeah. And you're sort of going through the meditative states, these different jhanas, and you're describing them. And some people see that and they're like, well, wait a second, how can you be in this state and then describe it? It would seem to be, that doesn't make sense. So could you explain that a little bit, and how you're able to kind of walk through these different jhanas, and then also, give some descriptions of them?
Yeah. Well, first of all, actually, in the video, I'm not doing the jhanas, just Sean is, and there's an interesting reason for that,
which we'll get to.
Which we can get into, but it's because I guess there's something we could talk about, like light jhanas, where you're able to, you've got the meditation object in mind, you're really focusing it, and you can be building the sukha, say, and yet it's not crazy that you can have that as your what is in attention, what is really being highlighted as the most salient object in your experience at that moment, and still in the background sort of vaguely kind of say, oh, this is happening, or Sean maybe even kind of dipping out or fading out of the jhana to describe a little bit and then kind of home back in on it. And when you're good at meditating, you do have this malleability to move your attention to kind of duck out and then slightly go back in and sort of home your attention back on the point. And
right.
I mean, I think also one way to give credit to Sean and when I claim my attempts to the jhana is like, if you have a clear moment, a clear recognition of like you're really with the object, so much so that it really felt like it was encompassing your entire experience because you're just so on it. You have such a clear, precise vision of this meditation object. It becomes undoubtable that even if it was just for like, a second or so, that happened, that was my experience. That was really real. That was the most important thing happening in the room at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, so I know that
makes sense.
Yeah, Bracington has done some brain scan studies and I guess fMRI studies while he's doing these states and whatnot, and he will basically have to indicate to the researchers like, okay, now I'm about to go into jhana 1 or jhana 2 or whatever, but he'll kind of have to pop out of it for a second and then say, wait 30 seconds or so before you look at what those scans are, because I'll have to kind of get his way back into it. Which actually, before we get into some of this other material, more biographical, I'm interested. I'm it's supposed to come today, actually. I just ordered a Muse S. And so basically it's a personal EEG machine that you can wear and you can track your brainwaves. Yeah. Cool. I'm curious if you've ever used one of those or done any of that.
No, I'd love to though.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this. And I'm really intrigued by, it'd be fascinating. One of the things I want to experiment with is like, can we find distinct EEG patterns for the distinct jhanas? I've been looking online. I've only been able to find one sort of study around that, or I wouldn't, maybe studies. It's not quite like a peer-reviewed research thing, but someone has some materials on that. But it was interesting because you don't really see too much of the stage progression of jhanas per se, but one thing, and I'll post this or I'll show it in the video or something, one thing that you do see very clearly is this cessation that comes at the end, where literally you can watch all the brain waves just come to a close, and that seems to like show what you are talking about with these cessation states, which again, very interesting stuff. So anyway, more to come on that. I'm really intrigued by that material. But to get into your experience, so as that little bio I read kind of intimates, your experience is one where there's what a decentering. Explain what you mean, or explain maybe what the progression has been in terms of I don't know, your change of states and now maybe a transition to a new permanent state or a new trait, or how that happened and what that really means.
Yeah, exactly. So, because I would say, along the path, there were a series of moments in which sort of, the sort of remodeling of the sort of structure of the mind changed. And I'm talking about a change that becomes the new default now, and not something I have to pull some kind of meditative trick or attentional move to induce or something like that. I can kind of walk through some of the big steps or kind of go straight to this last one, but should I do that? Or
why don't you first describe a little bit what that last one is, and then kind of explain how that progressed.
Sure. So this last shift, and I really try to come up like with my own words. So like in that bio, you said like, hey, there's no singly positioned epistemic agent. Like these are the kind of words that I try to use to avoid, if I use jargon like, okay, fourth path, arhantship, these kind of things. And then, yeah, I mean, even with the jhanas, there's so much debate there. It's like, what are you talking about? No way. So if I just more clearly just explain, okay, this is what it's like to be me, call it whatever you want. So yeah, the most noticeable shift is before they used to feel like there was some epistemic agent in the head, some cluster of sensations, but actually when I peered my attention into it, I could see that it was really empty, and I could even see that this sort of sensation would appear and disappear. But it still felt like knowledge was being attributed to some subject point here. And so that whenever anything arose in the experience space, the information still had to travel back to this epistemic agent for it to be known. It's like, even though something's happening here, it's known here. The difference now is the mind is no longer even generating this epistemic agent, this point here. I don't even feel like a cluster of sensations back here or feeling some kind of reference point. And so things appear where they do in the experience space, and there's a sense that they're just known there. So, something that's like really cool, I find, is like when I'm listening to music, is I can place a speaker in the corner of the room, and the sound is being emitted from the speaker, and maybe the body is in the other corner of the room, but the knowing of the sound and the music is all at the source point of the speaker. And it's like the body has nothing to do with knowing the music, if you follow me.
Sure. So yeah, it sounds fascinating. It sounds I think because it sounds so alien to kind of if saying something like a standard normal human phenomenological experience, whatever that is, it's so different from that it's hard to conceptualize and think about. Yes. I mean, so explain a little bit, like, I'm looking at you, I'm talking to you, you're seeing things, you're having emotions, you're smiling, you're talking, you're doing things. But so how does that relate to then that decentered epistemic agent? I mean, are you just aware of those sensations, but it doesn't feel like there's a kind of singular ego kind of that unites all those into some entity or something?
Yeah, there's interesting phenomenology to get into with the sense of self as well. And I think there's another, I felt like, okay, before this centerlessness, I was very in touch with no self. I really had this sort of sense that whatever I pointed my attention to, despite the sense that there felt like there was a center to experience and the knower here, I still wouldn't have said I am the knower, or whatever I point my attention to. It was clear to me, okay, that's not me, not self. And there was a subjective feeling of not self. Like that doesn't feel like me. That doesn't feel like me. Whatever I point my attention to, my thoughts, they don't feel like me. But again, it's interesting because that feeling of no self is another kind of experience, another kind of appearing, in experience. And now it's like that's not even being generated. So I don't even have the feeling of no self and self. It's strange. I can't even sort of say like I really feel like
now
self.
It's interesting though, because I can understand that even better, because then there's a way of still having a centered self, even if you don't identify with it. But when you say that, like, you still experience the music, even if it's the other room, as though it's at the kind of origin point of the music itself, that's where I start to become really curious and intrigued. Because it seems like, okay, if the self is something that maybe is being generated in here, and it's at some fundamental point, let's say it's illusory in some way, we are still seemingly bound by our senses and our ability to pick up information as it relates to this body, right? So like, I can't know what my friend Jeremy in Ohio is experiencing or thinking right now because I'm not locationally, So that's where I always start to get, I guess, a little bit even skeptical. Not to say that I'm being skeptical of your experience.
Yeah.
I'm most interested in, like, how is it possible?
I encourage you to be skeptical.
But like, so I don't know. Can you explain that either
Yeah.
either theoretically or phenomenologically, what it's like to have a body.
Well,
And yeah,
I'll try to do both. So
sure.
this, because I think this is a interesting distinction that often doesn't get passed out when we're talking about the self. I think we can talk about it in two different ways, and often people don't realize if they're conflating these two ways, where you can talk about the felt sense of self phenomenologically in experience. What do I feel numerically identical to, one and the same as, or what do I identify with? Which is a different way of talking about the self than if I'm talking about like in a more ontological way and sort of theorizing. So, for example, some people you ask, okay, what are you? And they might say, oh, I'm a brain. Experientially, you have no insight and inference into your brain, to a brain. You don't see a brain, smell a brain, any of these things. But they might really believe, okay, I am a brain. And so, you know, we can go down that path and talk about, okay, sort of, yeah, more metaphysically, ontologically, what are you? And I might say, well, there's clearly some kind of hub of like really strongly knitted together information processing sort of system here, in which the exchange of information is located, is bound, and yeah, information about what Jeremy is doing in some other part of the country, it just, that information cannot travel to be known around this center. Yeah, so, but then, you know, just phenomenologically, there's just one experience here. Yeah, maybe you can ask some more probing
Sure.
questions.
So like when you talk about that music analogy, like even though it's in the other room, you have an experience of it as being kind of from the origin. Is that like, is that because at one point, like recently, you just did experience it at the origin, and even though you are now away from it, you've still had that phenomenological reality that now you can sort of almost extrapolate based on that? Whereas like if I were to play music here when you're not around, you wouldn't be able to have access to that, and so you wouldn't be able to experience that music from its origin. Like there needs to be some point of contact, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. So I mean, the way I try to make sense of this is, I think this isn't a controversial opinion, especially probably in the metamodern scene, that you live within your own world simulation, right? But the world simulation, your world simulation, does pertain to something that is, you know, an organism with organs, right? So clearly this being has to be in earshot of the music to hear it. In which case, you know, the sound waves do have to travel to the organs of hearing. But experientially, within your world simulation, that's, the physics are not the same. That the system, it's just, the sound is just appearing in its place in the experience. Does that make a bit more sense?
Sure. That is helpful. Because where I myself, and this is where I am now, I think it's a good place to be, and so that's why I hold this position. But I'm certainly, other people think differently. But where I am with these things generally is, as soon as someone starts making claims about information that they don't have access to because telepathy, you know, psychic energy, something like that, that's when I say, no, I don't believe that, you know. But that doesn't mean what you're saying isn't possible, that whatever the information is that you are immediately perceiving, that can be radically reoriented or reframed, or, you know, experienced in a radically different framework. So, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. Maybe that isn't what you're saying, or is it something more like that?
Yeah, I've got no contention with what you just said.
So then, so I mean, I'd love to, you know, we could dive into all that phenomenology, and maybe we can come back to it. But say a little bit more about how this came to be the case, and what, if there's a relationship here with the jhanas specifically, or with a meditative practice specifically.
Yeah, they could very well be, because this shift took place while I was in the fourth jhana, actually. So maybe I can just tell the story. But I was on a 2-week jhana retreat in Portugal. Just you know, me and 4 other friends kind of set this up in the countryside. It's really nice. We're doing this, and on the 3rd day of the jhana retreat, the last sit of the day, I was yeah, well, so I was, Lee Brasington's book was one of our, instruction guides. And I remember in between, lunchtime, maybe I was sort of reading a chapter in the book, and he talks about, insight practice. And he says, the fourth jhana is a good place to do insight practice. It's a very sort of clean, sort of stable state, not a lot of, crazy distractions or anything happening there. And then he talked about dependent origination, just as an example. It's like, for example, you could do contemplation on dependent origination. And I kind of read that to him. I was like, oh yeah, good idea, Lee. And then later on in the day, yeah, so I did just that. And it's one of these things. I think for a while I felt like something was building. I felt like I was just around the corner. I'm so close to something close. And then under the right conditions, under retreat, perhaps, things came together and it happened. But so I'm sitting in the fourth jhana, and so just saying this will maybe anger some people, but I'll say I was hearing a bird outside. But some people are like, you shouldn't be hearing anything in the jhanas. but I was hearing a bird, and there was a sense, okay, how do I know the bird? How do I know the sound of this bird? And it's like, well, there's a sound appearing in consciousness, in experience. But there's still a sense that the knower is here, at some point here. And for whatever reason, because I've got high equanimity in the fourth jhana, really good attentional skills. I did the classic move where you point attention back as itself, looking at that source point, and then, yeah, for whatever reason, it was I think seen through, and one way I described it, I believe this sense that there is a knower in the middle of experience is actually amodal perception. One way I describe it, I could talk more about what I mean by that, but just to explain more of the story. So that kind of disappeared, and then I realized, oh no, hang on, the sound of the bird is just knowing where the sound of the bird is appearing in experience. And then there was this like kind of declustering and things syncing up and really cool. And then there was this brief moment of like total existential fear, like there's no ground to stand on, and then and everything went, and yeah, that was really cool. And then life has never been the same again.
Fascinating. And so when you came out of that meditation sit, then was there a sense that you did go back to some other state, or was there a sense that you just persisted in that state, or like was there a shift between the end of that sit and say what you're experiencing now, or fundamental continuity or something?
Yes, yeah. So immediately after, when it happened, the body actually kind of went into shock. Like I was like, everyone else was still meditating, but I was just kind of like, for I don't know how long, because what I was experiencing I'd never experienced before, and I've experienced a lot of wacky altered states, but this was something I'd never had before. And yeah, and then the meditation, I was just what meditation ended, and then we had like a little 5-minute break before we were going to come back into the meditation hall. But yeah, the body was like kind of like a bit in shock, actually. Like I couldn't kind of stay still, and it was cool though. but then it's interesting, and I'm still trying to make sense of the difference here, because in some way you want to say, okay, at that point something kind of crystallized or has been sturdy and unchanging, and yet, still being a human, I still feel progress and development, maybe even faster now.
So to speak to that a little bit, what is that when you say development? Because this is the context for a lot of this, and I'm not sure if I set this up. Maybe I talked to you about it briefly, but for if I haven't talked about it yet, in the actual thing here, I'm really interested in. I guess I said a little bit of this at the outset, but I'm really interested in how these ideas of states can lead to permanent altered, stages or traits, or however you want to think about that it's more than just that a state, I have this high meditative state now, but then once the meditation ends, I come back down, and it's like that's a temporary thing. But I'm intrigued by this notion that if there are certain things that you do, they can lead you to a place where eventually it does kind of crystallize, and now you've got a new default, as you say. And so at the same time, as you also say, you're still around, you're still a human, you're still developing. So when you talk about developing after this, do you mean in further conscious state exploration, or do you just mean learning new things, thinking new thoughts, having new insights, or what does that mean, development?
Yes, the latter, pretty much. So yeah, once the center dropped away on that third day, it hasn't come back like this. And
do you miss it at all?
Not at all. Not at all. No, okay. No. I mean, this. I think this part, because people are obviously very interested in the phenomenology and the cool, like, okay, what's your perception like now? But the part that can't be understated enough is the sheer reduction in suffering and increase in baseline well-being. Like that. That's what you really want. That's what we all really care for. And this is the best thing I've ever experienced in my life. This is so good.
So do you still, I mean, you're walking around, you stub your toe, ouch, that hurts. I mean, there must be those experiences of suffering in some way. What is that like if there's a decentered subject?
Yeah. So I'm still adverse to painful stimuli. But it's crazy. People make some claims like, oh, there's a 99% reduction in suffering. And before I would have been like, that's just hyperbolic, extreme, absurd. That's insane. And now I get what they're talking about. Like, is so much of our suffering is psychological, because there's just an existential wrestle with life that is just not present anymore. So yeah, I'm still adverse to painful stimuli, but luckily I live in a first world country and sort of a place where I don't have to worry too much about those kind of threats.
What would you say about like there's a way? All right, so I'm gonna interpret a little bit what you're saying, and also correct me if I'm wrong there, but there's almost, I would just presume that because your sensations are not like you in the old sense, that even if they are adverse or negative or painful, that they're not then therefore experienced as suffering in the same way, because they're not attached to that. Like, it's not like I am suffering, it's that I am experiencing this sensation, which is, adverse or negative or something. Is that fair as an intro to this thought?
Yeah, I mean, it could well be more complicated.
Sure.
Than that,
I
simplistically, yes. Yeah.
And so, but then my thought would be that there are also ways in which psychological pathologies can shape thoughts in a similar manner, of like dissociation, right? Like, I experience something, but it's almost too painful that I separate it off, and so I'm able to deal with it. But that's a pathological form of that experience, whereas what you're talking about seems deeply salutary. Could you speak to that kind of a distinction at all?
Maybe not so well, but I'm still functioning healthily in society. My relationships with my friends and loved ones are, going very well, and I feel very confident of how appropriate I am to behave out in the world, and I'm not doing anything erratic or totally antisocial or anything like that.
Right. Yeah, I guess I mean that, like, it's interesting how a similar framing of something can be both highly salutary, but that there are ways of something happening in a similar way that don't achieve the same level of integration or something like that, or something is different, in which dissociation is different than what you're talking about, I guess, would be the presumption. So, okay. So and if well, I want to jump back, but if you have anything more that you want to add about the whole thing at this point, feel free to elaborate, or I can.
Yeah, I think there's like a cool kind of analogy I've been trying to build to sort of represent the difference in experience here with like a spider's web. So a spider's web, the way it's set up is there is a center point, and the spider will be hanging out at some point on the web. And when a fly flies into the web, in order for the spider to know that, okay, a potential next meal has landed on his web, there has to be enough slack in the web so that the vibrations can ripple out and that information can reach the spider, aka the epistemic agent, who's located at one spot on the web. And I think of like, okay, well, the amount of slack or the rippling of the web sort of represents volatility and sort of like stress in the system, and it has to like kind of dissipate out. And so that would be like the previous setup of mind. And so now the way I'd explain my mind is, okay, remove the center and remove the spider as one single epistemic point in which all information must ripple back towards this guy, and attribute knowing to the web itself. And then you can have this kind of lattice, sort of straight, tighter web setup. So the fly can land anywhere, be any kind of sensation or stress point. But because the web can now afford to be tighter, because the information is known in the point that it arises and it doesn't need to travel throughout the whole web to one single point, the spider epistemic agent, then there's less volatility and rippling in the whole system. And so it sort of, it dissipates quicker and it's dealt with sort of more subtly, and it doesn't disrupt the whole rest of the system. That's one kind of illustration of
that's fascinating. Coming up with. Are there, since this experience, have you found materials of any sort that now that you read them, you're like, oh, I think I know, I think I have a good sense of what that's talking about, or that certain things have become more like illuminated to you since, because there are certain things, like you can read texts and they'll talk about something, but it'll just seem purely conceptual in a way that isn't really, whereas then if you have an experience, all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's what that's saying. I mean, have you had any experiences like that with materials or literature or anything like that since this?
Yeah, I think everyone goes through that, right? The only thing I'm thinking of right now is like, I remember an interview where Shinzen Young was talking about one of his I guess he was kind of having some conflict with one of his teachers, and his teacher said something like massage me with your anger. So I don't know if they were kind of had some beef or something like this, if I remember correctly. And it's like, massage me with your anger. What does that mean? And now I get that more. There's something strange is happening in experience where, like, if I have an interaction with someone, I can sense hostility. Obviously, I detect it and I feel it. And you can think, well, okay, this is, not pleasant. I'd rather not have this. But there's this interesting kind of ability I'm sort of discovering where even though normally this would be totally sort of colored with negative valence, I can see its sort of undulations, and there's something massage-like about it. Go.
Well, so I'm curious too. Well, and that what you're saying makes sense, I suppose. If rather than being the spider, if it's the whole web, then there's this sort of, I don't know, trying to extrapolate based on what you said, but I'd be curious how, I mean, you're about to start a master's program in epistemology and whatnot, and cognitive science. So I'm really curious to know how your experience has affected what you want to explore with your studies, and what your plans are with that.
Yeah, I'm curious too. I start next week, officially. So I'm also in a process where I'm like really curious, like what's going to come of the future, like what will Roger do, what is going to happen. But to talk about in the past, I think because I studied philosophy my undergraduate, and certainly I guess a lot of people sort of might shame, I don't know, but like the theoretical work as being like, oh, this is just intellectual, kind of circle jerking and stuff like this, but you need to really just sit on the cushion and do the practice. And yes, that's true, but the theories that I've read do inform my worldview understanding and how I might differently engage with the world and stuff like this. I know, like, reading a lot of papers on like the free will debate when I was younger, that sort of, so I think at one point, like, intellectuals sort of very convinced, oh, there is no free will. And then, then going home and sitting on the cushion and exploring my sense of free will, because I think for the most part, the free will debate just comes from people feel like they have free will. And I don't know what your position is, but then, exploring that feeling of free will and then seeing through it. And then, that was another thing that just, that feeling just stops getting represented in the mind at some point.
Yeah. Well, if we were to go into the free will direction, as Milton says in Paradise Lost, actually all in hell, all the demons go off and they start, doing their thing, and some of them turn to philosophy, and then they start talking about free will, and he says, and then they find themselves in wandering mazes lost. So like even fallen angels debating about free will just never were able to get their heads around that one. So I feel like we'd be in wandering mazes, well, or not. I mean, maybe you'd have a lot to offer now to this whole conversation in a debate based on some of this phenomenology. But let's just say, bracketing that for a second, I do want to go back a little bit and talk more about sort of what led up to this, and sort of what however you want to answer that question, I guess, and wherever you want to start with that story of like, how did that come to be? What were some of the interests that you're studying philosophy, and what brought you even to Bracington's work and Jhana meditation, etc.?
Yeah, it's a deep question, but it's a good question. So, it's strange. I wonder as well, like, why are certain people sort of, why do certain people gravitate towards meditation or contemplative practices? And, you can have highly intellectual people, but they never reflect backwards in some way, and sort of, miss phenomenology as a raw sort of first person subject. And I don't know, I was always had a philosophical kind of mindset as a kid, inquisitive about just the nature of reality. And so, I mean, a lot of my practice was recognizing the sort of epistemologically, we are on the consciousness side of things, and to experience something is to know something as intimately as you can know it. And so it's like, well, okay, yes, I'm really interested in scientific theories that I think do reveal a lot about the nature of reality as well. But what is this as close as I can know it? And I have to look very closely at my experience. So a lot of my practice was brought about by curiosity. I was motivated through curiosity. What is going on? What is this? What am I? What am I? Mm-hmm. Yeah, can you help me answer your question better?
No, that's a great yeah, that kind of gets at sort of the impetus, the motivation. I mean, maybe even just
in the jhanas,
yeah, and just sort of like how was it that you found yourself to that material? And
okay, yeah, so I mean, I had,
and maybe to clarify that too a little bit, because it seems to me that there are many different forms of meditation out there, and so I'm always intrigued too by like what lineages or what traditions or so and in the past I've been looking for other people who were doing jhana meditation in the way that I studied it from Bracington's book, and hadn't really found a lot. So I thought, oh, this must be kind of niche, I don't know. But yeah, I'm intrigued by maybe, I guess there's two questions there, and one is sort of, what was your particular story with finding that material specifically, and two, I mean, what would this is a much bigger question, so we don't have to tackle this, but like, what do you make of the proliferation, or that's not even the right word, but just the multiplicity of so many different traditions and lineages and styles, and what they have to offer in their own unique ways? Big question, maybe too big.
Yeah. Let me try with the first. So yeah, again, so I had some encounters with some altered states that kind of blew open the doors of perception and made me realize, okay, the spectrum of possible conscious states is way wider than I ever could have conceived. And so I was really curious, okay, what do these different perspectives offer, and how do they shape perception of reality? And so I really wanted to explore a lot of these different states, and when I meditating along the path, mostly I was just trying loads of different meditation techniques that seemed to offer get you to a desirable sort of state. And so I'd do the technique until I felt like, oh, okay, I got to the state that they were describing, and sort of become really familiar with that state and comfortable, be it like metta or loving kindness, for example. And the jhanas are just another one of those as well. And the jhanas were actually kind of the last sort of states I wanted to explore, sort of on my list. And part of this is to really figure out, okay, is there a particular corner of consciousness, a state I can enter that really is super desirable, that it really is, okay, this is the place to hang out in, this is the place to be. And what's interesting is, visiting all these sort of consciousness boutiques and seeing that, there's actually nothing kind of worth really sort of just staying in this one state for. And they talk about the jhanas are super pleasurable states to be in, and I won't disagree that there's something very pleasant about them for sure, especially compared to other more mundane regular states of consciousness. But it's like, yeah, it's still none of it's going to totally fulfill your soul, and that maybe I feel like that was why on this jhana retreat, perhaps why the shift could have taken place. Because I remember, even like on the third day, sort of doing all the jhanas, like, oh, this is cool, but it's, I don't know, existence is still difficult. Life is still difficult, and it's you got to realize, oh, hang on, stop looking to pleasurable sensations and sort of feelings to ultimately gratify you.
And yet you're saying that whatever this ultimate state was where it landed, that really is a mass improvement. It is I find that some of this language can become really hard to fully understand, because I think I get intuitively what you're saying, but it's interesting, right? It's like, yeah, well, pleasurable states isn't necessarily the point. There is, and yet when you get to like a deep equanimity, or maybe when you get to a agentless center or decentered agent, or whatever, however you want to put it, there is something also, it's beneficial, right? It's better than what was. But maybe the spectrum or the metric there isn't one of pleasure or pain, or it's not one of So yeah,
I can parse that out a bit. Maybe perhaps another analogy where it's like, okay, imagine you've got a room, and the room has its structure. It's got 4 walls and a ceiling of this high or whatever, and maybe a window and a door. But when you're moving between different sort of states, what that could be is you're just rearranging the furniture. But then the shifts, the more permanent shifts that have taken place, so I talk about this, a totally remodeling of the structure of my mind. It's not just about rearranging the furniture in the room where you're adding a green sofa, which might represent PT or something like this. It's like, no, you're like knocking down the walls and changing the whole shape of the room.
You found the door out of the room.
Yeah, you just knock down all the walls, basically.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Structure versus sort of state.
Yeah. that is really interesting, actually, because that gets back to that stages versus state thing. Structures is often a really good way of talking about structures of mind versus stages instead. But changing the very structure, I'm interested too. You briefly mentioned in our brief correspondence that because I mentioned that I was interested in integral theory and whatnot, and you mentioned that that had been an influence. Was any of, I mean, yeah, just talk a little bit about the influence of integral on you, and now that, I don't know, where you would assess its place and everything now.
Yeah. So I mean, for me, I'm not super deep into this work, but enough so that there's certain ideas being presented to being presented there that, like, when I learn about like spiral dynamics and integral theory kind of adopts spiral dynamics, that is a line of thinking that seems to unlock much more comprehension about the world. It seems like the world just makes more sense to me, sort of, having learned about this theory, whether it's true or not. But it's just there's less of a feeling of confusion. Why do people do what they do? And you sort of, oh, okay, well, here's a potential explanation. I really like, these distinguishing between the different avenues of human development, wake up, grow up, show up, clean up, or there's a different order there. But so, I feel like, I've really woken up, but that's not to say that I'm the most grown up or something like that. I'm still quite young. And so I certainly wouldn't say that I'm like super wise and all these things. And so I still see, areas to develop in there.
Yeah, that's something that I've appreciated about the framework, is like, because otherwise there tends to be this conflation of, oh, this person has had some really profound state experiences, or maybe it's even become permanent, therefore they are a moral exemplar and know everything about all things or something, right? And it's sort of like, no, maybe you need to differentiate that there are these different ways in which something can be highly developed. And certainly there's probably all sorts of interactions and correlations between those, but it helps to explain a little bit of that phenomenon of like, but how did this seemingly deeply enlightened person do this terrible thing? Why did that become a cult, and why did this, and I found that a helpful framework to begin to elucidate that, because there is this sort of sense that then someone can go around and basically pronounce their perspectives on something which might be influenced by or highly oriented according to some high state achievement, but that doesn't necessarily make you a brilliant foreign policy expert, or have any deep understanding of the physical makeup of reality per se. And so that's one of those areas where I'm interested in developing better frameworks around spirituality, because historically there's often been this conflation of all this material that, oh, once you're enlightened, now you can talk about like what everything's made up of and stuff like that. And I don't know, maybe there is an element of that. Again, maybe when you do insight and you start looking into, certainly from a like, what's the mind made up of, but that's probably a different thing than like, what's this table made up of? I don't know, or maybe not. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, being an epistemologist.
Well, yeah, exactly. I've sort of been thinking, when you've, this is no guarantee, but when you've dealt more with your own internal baggage, I feel like that frees you up in a lot of ways to think more clearly, to give more charitable interpretations of what people are saying, so be more here and present to understand. So, I don't know that full enlightenment is necessary, but certainly emotional peace will help with your sense making. I think that,
definitely, yeah, for sure. Yeah. I was also curious how you would what you make of language around, say, like non-duality, and like, is I'm trying to think. I'm even just finding language about how to refer to it in a way that doesn't seem silly or I don't know, kind of overly simplistic or something, but just to refer to your experience and your state of mind, or whatever that, however we want to refer to that. I mean, is that a non-dual state, or not necessarily, because you're still interacting with an external objective world, or it's, I don't know. How would you address the question of non-duality?
Yeah. Well, but, people again give different definitions of non-dual and different criteria. It feels very non-dual because there isn't a sense of boundaries, just the raw experience, and even still understanding context and concepts and delineating sort of the distinction between the table and the floor and such like that. There's a deep insight into emptiness, so that though even those concepts can arise and I can make sense of them and use them in the mind, there's still like never really buying into them or believing them. The concepts are all still sort of very airy and sort of fuzzy. And I know before having a deep enough insight into emptiness, when the concepts arise in the mind, you totally buy into them. You totally think the universe is made of things that are tables and things that are not tables, and you feel like that's a very real distinction in the world. And that just, those distinctions loosen up and break apart. And so it's so it totally feels very non-dual. But you could talk about states in which, imagine that everything is just like one color and like one point, and that's not my experience. So yeah.
Right. I'm also curious too, and I want to make sure that we don't not talk about this. So now you no longer do jhana meditation because you can't do jhana meditation, it sounds like. So explain a little bit about why and what that means.
Yeah. I'm still trying to understand this as well, and I don't know if it's so much that I can't, or that the inclination to do it is totally dropped off, because my current state of being is so pleasant. I don't have the urge to state shift or something, or to try to alter the conditions of my experience to get into another thing. Like, I'm just normally experiencing enough sukha and sort of pleasure emotions as it is. And like in the fifth and sixth jhana, this notion of like boundless space and boundless consciousness, like before there was a move that needed to be done to get into such an understanding or relationship with existence. And now boundless space, well, I don't even perceive a boundary. I don't have this. Before there were these sort of pillars on the side of experience. It felt like it was holding up the bubble of the mind here. That's not felt or experienced anymore. And then the boundless consciousness is, everything is perceived as being aware of itself. So that I had an interesting talk with Ingram, though, sort of talking about this, and he was like, well,
this is Daniel Ingram.
Daniel Ingram, yes. But perhaps you could still go into a state where there's a sense of boundless space, but you're removing the content. So it's like just boundless space, and it's all uniform space, not with different, populated with different objects or something like that. But can I not do that? Maybe I'd have to. I just haven't even tried it. Yeah. It's like I just don't have the incentive, because it's just so nice to just kind of just be as I am.
Well, I'm intrigued. One of the things, so a little background with me too. So I discovered jhanas. Actually, so I was at Yale. I was in Yale Divinity School, but actually this wasn't at the Divinity School. This was at the university itself, where I took a Buddhism class. And my background before had been largely in literature and epic poetry and religion and stuff like that, philosophy. So I knew Dante really well. I loved Dante. And what happened for me was I was in a Buddhism class, and we did a whole section on Buddhist cosmology, and he shows the map of Buddhist cosmology, and I'm like, holy shit, that's like the Dantean universe, like, and so I was so fascinated by this that I wrote a paper on comparing just, kind of a standard kind of comparative analysis of like the Buddhistic cosmology and sort of the medieval Christian cosmology. But through that process, I discovered some really interesting overlaps between basically the in the Christian cosmos, there's the Empyrean, and the divine realm of the celestial hierarchy and all that pseudo Dionysius stuff. And I found some really interesting parallels in the Buddhist cosmology with these different devas. And the unique part about the Buddhist cosmology was that these higher entities or beings or spirits, basically the way you showed up there was by your jhana practice. You like these entities exist because there's a like a mapping of not just kind of cosmological topography, but it's mapped onto states of consciousness, which is something that the Christian cosmology doesn't really have as much. But so I got really intrigued by this notion that like these celestial spirits, the devas, are like inhabiting these different jhana states, which is what introduced me to that. And then I started looking into that, and then that of all the ways into this, that's how I found Lee Bracington's work. So I bring all that up because where this kind of leads, I'm really intrigued by the differences between kind of Buddhist traditionally religious concepts and Christian ones. And one of the profound differences is that in Buddhism, that there's this, emptiness is like a really important theme and topic, and kind of a deep fundamental ontological ground is rooted in emptiness. Whereas in Christianity, there's almost more the sense of fullness, the pleroma, the fullness of the deity, and that when Dante gets up to heaven and he has the beatific vision, it's not of an emptiness, it's of a kind of cosmic fullness. And so I mention all of this because Lee Bracington actually has an interesting point that I think boundless consciousness, which is what, Jhana 7?
Boundless consciousness 6.
Okay, 6. Okay.
7 is nothingness.
Gotcha. Exactly. So I was really interested because he makes the point that he says that if you grow up in a monotheistic culture, like a Christian, context, if you have that experience, you're probably apt to interpret that along the lines of you've just experienced the Godhead. You have had an experience of basically uniting with, cosmic consciousness. And that's a very sort of, that would fit really well in a Western contemplative, framework. But then there's jhana, the next jhana, which is, that emptiness, where this question's leading. All that's kind of lead up to this question of coming from a Western and a Christian context in my past. I'm very interested in theology and the notions of God, which don't appear as much in the Buddhistic context and more center around that kind of emptiness. But I'm curious if you think about, well, maybe I'll just phrase it as a question. How does the word God mean anything significant? Is it what does it mean to you in your framework of thinking? And how does that relate to maybe the jhana states of boundless consciousness, and how might all that relate to where you find yourself now in terms of the conscious state that is now your new default? Man, that's a question, huh?
You just asked me the God question. I can't believe it.
Yeah.
Let me try. I'm not opposed to the word God. I really have sort of sympathy with that view, and I don't mind people talking about God. Like what is God? We could just say, well, okay, it's the biggest entity in existence. That's one way to put it. And then what kind of attributes do you give to God? I know there's certain states and experiences to have where the sense that I am God seems very real to you, sort of very weighty in sort of soundness or validity, maybe not soundness, but validity. And that, the way I understand that experience is like the sense of when you really get in touch. I don't know this so relates to the jhanas, and maybe I'm not the right person to ask because it depends maybe at what stage in your practice you're doing the jhana. So if, before I was doing the jhana, still very in touch with no self. But if you still sort of really have the strong sense of self, and then maybe you go into the sixth jhana, you've still got that really strong sense of identification, or perhaps even, even in my journey, there was a moment where I was identifying with awareness. I am awareness. Really felt I am awareness. And then awareness is sort of in everything. So I am everything. And yeah, that God experience can be very much like, okay, the sense of I-ness that I have is somehow not personal, not individual. And the way the sense of I can be expressed in experience, there's only one way, that raw I am, the knower of experience. And so any being that has this sense of I, or sense of I am a subject knowing experience, phenomenologically, that raw I-ness has to show itself the same in all conscious subjects. And if God is a conscious entity, and he is self-aware, he knows I exist, and then you have this strong, I am God. The I that is appearing in this local entity is felt and experienced the same as the I that appears in God.
Well, then the question for me though is like, well, maybe there is an experience of that fundamental I-ness, and then that might be experienced as a, wow, that was a profound mystical unity with the divine, with God. Highly contextualized if you are in a Western or Christian context, or a, Abrahamic religious context. But it almost seemed, and this is why I brought in all that stuff about the comparative analysis of the maps and stuff, and even the jhana stuff, is that well, maybe there's a point after that, right? Maybe the I-ness itself dissolves, and that then you're not really in sort of union with the monotheistic entity domain anymore, because the very I-ness that might constitute, the great I am, the great deity, that even dissolves, and now and that's why that idea seemed to intuitively kind of make sense to me, because it's sort of like, well, maybe that is the experience of sort of going from jhana 6 to jhana 7. You go from boundless consciousness to the emptiness. Or maybe in trying to map this out, there's a better way of mapping that shift. Maybe there is still a sense of I-ness in the emptiness that then is finally what dissipates. I don't know, but these are, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think even in jhana 7, there's still sort of a subject-object divide, and then that disappears in jhana 8, neither perception nor non-perception. But I've got some thoughts on sort of going beyond the sort of God state. Is like, one thing I think Buddhism does really interesting is just mapping the timeline of emergent properties in experience and seeing which one comes first, and that it's possible to have experience without the I-ness. And so if you want to say that God has, or God is that ultimate self-aware being, the big I, experientially, that I is actually a latent property. Right. It comes later. Right. First you need time and space to appear in, consciousness. Or first you need consciousness and then time and space, perhaps. And then the I appears. Right. And so if you have enough metacognition here, you can track that progress of how, in what order things appear. Right. And then you can even dissolve the I-ness, move back a step, and say, okay, back to
Well, right. And then this is where these notions about, you were talking about non-duality has different definitions according to different people. And the same with God too, right? So God could be to someone the great I am, the great I-ness. But then for other people, God is just whatever is the most fundamental ground. And so someone like Eckhart, for example, Meister Eckhart talks about God and then the Godhead, right? So he even makes a distinction between like the God that we think of as the God, and then like the real God above God, God beyond God, which would be the kind of, so you're just kind of, it's kind of a definitional slippage in some ways, but you're kind of putting that milestone, you're moving it a little bit further.
Right. Moving the goalpost.
Right. But yeah, yeah, I don't really know where to go from there, but fascinating stuff. Is you're stable to do cessation meditation practice? That's what when Sean was doing the jhana meditation, you were doing cessations,
Mhm.
right? So what is that? Describe that a little bit, and why that's still sort of something that, you know, something you can or you know are interested in still exploring.
Well, yeah, you said you I forget what you said. You can or you do cessation practice like as if it's like an active thing, and it doesn't feel like it just happens sporadically, and it's it doesn't happen every time I sit to meditate, but then it happens, yeah, sort of very frequently as well.
Can you describe
Multiple
that
times.
experience a little bit, like what that means?
Yeah, so a cessation is when experience, conscious experience just blanks out for a moment. So the cessation itself is actually not an experience. But the before and after is I'm sitting and just not doing anything, like totally not engaging with the world, sort of, do nothing meditation, which is really, how you get to the eighth jhana. And um, at some point, yeah, it's like all the sense doors defocus, and then there's this sort of sense of like a or like a rush or something, and then there's no experience, and then immediately there's this feeling of refreshment, and like you've reset the machine, and you're sort of back online, and yeah.
Huh. And so one of the things that I've been getting from a lot of the stuff I'm reading is that, like Wilber, for example, will talk about there's this always present awareness, the witness. How does that relate to cessation? Because I mean, are there instances in which there is just pure, not even awareness or a witnessing or any kind of anything going on?
Yeah, yeah. What does Wilbur mean exactly by the witness? Because I could understand that in a
I
different
think you'd
way.
probably be in a better position to tell me, but I think what he means is at least the idea that, you know, you can, at the core, at the fundamental, that kind of ground of being, there's this non-dual reality, which is neither, you know, it's non-dual, but it is, there's a witnessing, there's an awareness, there's a perceiver, a seer, a something that is sort of a kind of fundamental consciousness that's having, and then, you know, it's like, well, what kind of experience is non-subject object dualistic and all that stuff, but there at the ground of it is the witness. And so it sounds like in a cessation experience, maybe that isn't even there, but I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, this is again, I almost like the God question. I would ask, like, okay, what attributes are you affording the witness? Is
Sure.
is there, with the witness, really the sense of a subject knowing experience, an experiencer in addition to experience that's always present? I'd say no. It's possible to drop that, but something about always being conscious. I mean, interesting things, we would want to point to sleep, right? When, in deep sleep, there's seemingly nothing, no experience.
Or
And
anesthesia. I mean, when I broke my leg, they knocked me out and I woke up again and there was no consciousness to speak of. So I'm always intrigued by this
yeah.
notion of some deep consciousness. But yeah, sorry, go on.
And when you woke up, did you feel refreshed? Was it like a really long cessation?
Well, they just opened up my leg and you know, did surgery on it. So I wasn't feeling too great when I woke up. More groggy and confused.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, okay. But I mean, yeah. So it seems like cessations are hard to verify, because it's like, okay, well, you're saying there's no experience, but then if there's no experience, there's no one to know of that thing. So it's like, how do we get some kind of more third person objective measures of this? Is where maybe
Right. Well, that's where
EEG
the
might be
EEG stuff is,
interesting.
and
Yeah,
I'll already probably have shown it, but like you just see all the brain waves just collapse.
yeah.
So and then for me, fundamentally, metaphysically, ontologically, whatever you want to say, I'm curious, and like there seems to be a claim in a lot of these different traditions that like, but there's still something there, right? Because I think that's sort of the idea, is that like that there is a background conscious thing. And I don't know.
I yeah, I get what they're talking about. I totally get what they're talking about. You know, I've had experiences as well where I was aware in deep sleep, and it's like kind of like there was no time or space, no sense of personal history or self or these things, and yet there was still an isness there. Cessation does not feel like an isness. There's a jump cut in experience. You really feel like, yeah, as Ingram explains, I like this explanation, like someone has like cut out some of a couple frames from your personal movie.
Yeah. Well, I have so many more questions. I really want to keep talking. My battery's about to die, which is sort of my main hard stop at the moment. And or maybe it'd be really fitting if everything just cut out, speaking right when we're talking about cessation, even just a hard stop.
There we go. Cessation, yes.
But anyway, the reality of the difference between phenomenological experience and these sort of intersubjective things that we can point to and use data and stuff about is that like then you only have someone who maybe has had that experience who can share it. And so it's when you read a lot about these ideas conceptually, but don't have access to someone who can speak to it phenomenologically, there's a something's missing from your account. So I appreciate you helping me fill in some of these things. And for me, the development of a meditative practice is to build out that experience for myself, which I think is sort of the idea, is that it's not just then secondhand, but you understand firsthand what these things mean. Brendan,
thank you very much. And yeah, I mean, on that point, I just want to say, like, I want to be a source of no BS, sort of like relaying, what's possible, this is achievable, stuff like this, and really trying to help the whole world understanding of what's.
We'll hopefully talk again later. So thank you.
Thank you, Brendan.
Take care.